Isthmus of Panama was attractive to the growing American empire. A canal across these 37 miles would be hugely profitable, improve American commerce, and speed military movements. One problem was that Panama was a province of Colombia since 1821 that demanded a large share of the profits a canal would generate. The solution was to send U.S. Marines to invade Panama and steal it. This fact does not appear in official history, which pretends that Panamanians declared independence from Colombia in 1903 and gave the land to the United States. The American Empire became interested in Panama as thousands of Americans heading to California chose that route, especially during the gold rush that began in 1849. Crossing the isthmus required a winding week-long journey using boats, mules, and walking to reach the Pacific. A railroad across the isthmus would be valuable and profitable. A group of American investors negotiated a deal with Colombia to build one. They were concerned about security in wild Panama and insisted the U.S. military be allowed to protect their railroad when needed. As a result, in 1846, the United States signed a treaty with Colombia by which the United States guaranteed Colombian sovereignty over Panama and was authorized to build and protect a railroad across the isthmus. This was completed in 1855 and proved very profitable. U.S. Marines landed a few times to help the Colombian Army deal with local peasant guerrillas who wanted a share of the wealth. A canal across the isthmus would be far more profitable. Ferdinand de Lesseps, a Frenchman who built the Suez Canal, started the Panama Canal Company in 1880 to build one. However, cutting a canal through hilly jungle with frequent rain and mosquito-borne illnesses made that too difficult. His company went bankrupt in 1889 and construction stopped. Wealthy Frenchman Philippe Bunau-Varilla acquired control of the bankrupt Panama Canal Company and hoped to sell the company that still owned land and equipment in Panama. He hired a powerful lobbyist who convinced the U.S. Congress to appropriate $40 million to buy the company in 1902. But funds were contingent on negotiating a treaty with Colombia for a canal through its province of Panama. American President Theodore Roosevelt had a strong interest in completing the canal. A treaty was negotiated with a Colombian diplomat in January 1903. Colombia would receive a $10 million annual payment, and the United States would have a renewable lease in perpetuity for the land proposed for the canal. The United States Senate quickly ratified the treaty, but the Colombian Senate thought it too generous and demanded more money and taxes on imported goods. As a result, President Roosevelt devised a secret plan to seize Panama. He met with Frenchman Bunau-Varilla and José Arango, an attorney for the American-owned Panama Railroad Company, and Manuel Amador, pictured, who became the first president of Panama. Bunau-Varilla wrote a constitution for Panama and provided funds to bribe key Colombian officials. The commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps was ordered to embark every available Marine on U.S. Navy warships. These warships were secretly ordered to Panama and landed their Marines on November 2, 1903. U.S. Marines assumed that a major rebellion was underway and were there to help the Colombian Army suppress it, as they had done in the past, but were surprised to learn there was no rebellion or violence. Colombian troops were also surprised by the arrival of U.S. Marines, but took no action because Manuel Amador had invited their officers to a social event on the Pacific side of the isthmus. On November 3rd, the U.S. government announced that Panama had declared its independence from Colombia. José Arango, an attorney for the Panama Railroad Company, led the so-called revolutionaries, pictured, who consisted of fewer than a dozen unarmed wealthy men who had no public support. President Roosevelt recognized the new nation of Panama the next day, while U.S. Navy warships blocked sea lanes to prevent landings by Colombian troops. The only violence occurred when a Colombian gunboat shelled Panama City for half an hour, resulting in one civilian death. Meanwhile, in Colón, Colombian forces, led by Colonel Eliseo Torres, remained in a standoff with a smaller U.S. force backed by the U.S. Nashville's big guns for 2 days. The situation was resolved when the USS Dixie arrived with more Marines, having been delayed by mechanical problems. With an $8,000 bribe paid to Colonel Torres, the Colombian troops departed aboard a British Royal Mail steamer. Outnumbered Colombian troops elsewhere accepted cash payments to disarm and disperse. The United States announced that a treaty was quickly signed with the nation of Panama. This Bunau-Varilla Treaty is the most laughable treaty in American history. It was negotiated in Washington, D.C., with French citizen Philippe Bunau-Varilla, pictured, who resided in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City and had been appointed Panama's ambassador to the United States by the Americans. He had not been to Panama for 17 years and would collect $40 million once Panama accepted the treaty dictated by the Americans. The terms of the treaty stated that the United States was to receive sovereign rights to a canal zone that was to extend 5 miles on either side of the canal route in perpetuity, and extensions of 3 nautical miles into the sea. Panama was to receive an annual payment of $250,000, rather than the $10 million annually that Colombia had rejected. The treaty was sent to Panama, and the so-called rebel leaders told to sign it. Several objected to ceding territory to the United States, but were ignored. They weren't elected leaders, and their signature was not required since U.S. Marines already controlled Panama. President Roosevelt worried that the Colombian Army might send a large force to recover its Panama province. The U.S. Navy was clearly superior to Colombia's, and there was no road that crossed the rugged Darien Gap to the rest of Colombia. A force of around 1,000 Colombian troops marched north along jungle trails but made slow progress. Roosevelt worried that the United States might become mired in a difficult jungle insurgency in Panama, like the one it recently endured in the Philippines. Rather than defend Panama in the jungles, Roosevelt planned to embark Marines in Panama on waiting ships for an amphibious assault on the Colombian port city of Cartagena, the country's chief source of tariff revenues. This would place Roosevelt in position to dictate the terms of a peace settlement in which Colombia would cede Panama and the Marines would withdraw from Cartagena. The Marines in Panama were organized into the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade to prepare for this invasion, while a U.S. Army brigade was ready for deployment to Panama to reinforce. The Colombian Army made it through the Darien Gap, but halted because it could not sustain a fighting force through the jungle trails. The invasion of Cartagena never occurred, although Marines remained in Panama for years to protect this new territory of the United States that became known as the Canal Zone. Years later, Colombia abandoned hopes to reclaim Panama and accepted a $25 million payment in 1921 as compensation. The building of the Panama Canal was a great achievement for the American Empire, yet began by stealing a valuable 10-mile swath of land from the nation of Colombia and the people of Panama.